seeking greater energy security. The Chinese Prime Minister is on a whistle-stop tour of the Gulf for talks with oil producers as the threat of sanctions on Iran is ratcheted up. But could Arab countries offset any drop in Iran's exports to oil-thirsty China, and at what price? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sue Turton. World leaders and energy experts are convening in Abu Dhabi for the 5th World Energy Summit. 650 delegates from 53 countries are at the 4-day conference, and all eyes are likely to be on the Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, who's currently on a 6-day tour of the Gulf. With the West threatening new economic sanctions on Iran over its nuclear programme, China's under pressure to reduce its reliance on Iranian oil. But Beijing is refusing to link business deals with Tehran's nuclear aspirations. China's rarely bowed to Western pressures and has been doing business with Iran since its revolution. The Chinese Premier's first stop was in Saudi Arabia, where he secured Chinese oil and gas investments within the kingdom. Tehran is watching this Chinese Gulf tour very carefully, with the West increasing the pressure on the Chinese to look elsewhere for oil. China is one of the world's biggest energy consumers and relies heavily on the Saudis as its chief source. With sanctions on Iran's oil industry threatening to cut off its ability to export, energy security was high on Wen's agenda in Riyadh. So, could Gulf countries offset Iran's oil supplies to China? Well, for more on this, we have our guests. In Beijing, Willem Van Kemenade, an author and China analyst. In London, Mamdouh Salameh, an economist and oil expert. And joining us from Beirut, Mohammad Marandi, a professor of political science at the University of Tehran. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. If I could first of all start with you, Mohammad Marandi. Could you enlighten us as to what the latest communication is between Washington and Tehran? We're hearing that there's been a letter sent to Tehran. Can you help at least set out what the current situation is?
Well, from my understanding, the United States has sent us a letter to Iran stating that if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, that the United States will respond. That's as far as I know. The Iranian response has basically been that Iran, under no circumstances, wants to block the Strait of Hormuz. But the point is that the United States is trying to impose an illegal blockade on Iranian oil by forcing third countries not to purchase Iranian oil, and also imposing sanctions on the Iranian Central Bank, which many consider already to be an act of war. In fact, Ron Paul, the U.S. presidential candidate, called it an act of war. What the Iranians are saying basically is that, fine, if the Europeans or the Americans don't want to buy Iranian oil, that's fine. But if countries in the region try to help the United States to prevent Iran from selling oil, and they increase their production in order to drive Iran out of the market, then that will be considered an act of hostility. And if Iran is not allowed to export oil to friendly countries, and third parties try to help the United States in this regard, then the Iranians will be forced to react. And the Iranians do believe they have the power to defend themselves and their interests.
Just let's pick up on that point with you, Willem Van Kemenade. Obviously, all eyes have been on China, who is currently across in the Gulf talking to various Gulf-rich states. Is China seriously talking to people like Saudi about taking over its oil supplies from Iran? Or is it just using this as a bargaining tool? I'm thinking of the fact that we're hearing that a deal has been done for China to have its investment in an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that's right. Well, China has given no indication that it will end its close relationship with Iran. But there is, of course, a crisis situation with all kinds of unpredictable elements. imagine Iran will not impose an all-out blockade indeed, but there is speculation now that a rogue Revolutionary Guard commander may provoke some incident, Israel may do something, or well, anything could aggravate the situation. And China has to hedge for that, of course. This visit was planned well before the current crisis started, and as you said, Premier Wen Jiabao has signed an investment agreement for an oil refinery. At the same time, China has strongly reiterated its opposition to not only the US project for enhanced unilateral sanctions, but also expressed a strong disapproval of the whole US attitude that it thinks that it can coerce countries around the world to support it in this scheme. And moreover, the Chinese have made it clear that they will only go along with sanctions if there is a new UN Security Council resolution. Well, that will not happen because both Russia and China have expressed their disapproval of that. It hasn't even come to a vote.
Mamdouh, Salameh, how important is Iran when it comes to supplying countries? Could the countries that use Iran at the moment to supply an awful lot of their own oil, could they cope if Iran was taken off the table, if there were sanctions and they had to look elsewhere?
Iran exports around 2 million barrels of oil a day. The biggest importer of Iranian oil is China. The Iranian oil exports are very important because the global oil market is very tight. And we know that OPEC members and other non-OPEC producers are not able to expand production. The OPEC members don't have any spare capacity. They are producing at full capacity.
I just interrupt very briefly there. It's an interesting point you make because most people hear that at least Saudi Arabia is not yet at capacity, has the chance to actually export more oil, but you're telling us that no, that is not the case.
That is not true. Saudi Arabia's oil production peaked in 2005 at 9.6 million barrels, and it has been declining since then. Last year, the average Saudi production was 8.2 million barrels, and what is more dangerous for Saudi is that they can't raise their production, and what is more, there is a very fast growing domestic consumption, which means that Saudi oil exports are declining fast. In 2010, Saudi oil exports averaged 5.25 million barrels. This year they will be slightly less, and the next year will be lesser as well.
So when a company like Nippon Oil and Energy, Japan's biggest refiner, when they say that they are talking to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to try and find an alternative crude oil supplier, do you think they're going to be met with closed doors?
Well, it is normal for big companies and for countries to look for alternatives. Unfortunately, they don't have this alternative. As I said, the global oil market is very tight, and OPEC cannot increase their production because of lack of capacity. Non-OPEC producers have already been producing at full capacity. Saudi cannot add much oil to the market. Consequently, it is a lot of talk. Iranian oil exports are very badly needed, and the market could not do without them.
Just moving on from that, obviously Iran's response has been quite a heated response to the sanctions. It has warned that any move by neighbouring Gulf Arab oil exporters to replace Iranian crude supply will not be taken lightly. Iran's OPEC representative, Mohammad Ali Khatibi, said if they give the green light to replacing Iran's oil, these countries will be the main culprits for whatever happens in the region, including the Strait of Hormuz. He went on to say our Arab neighbour countries should not cooperate with these adventurers. These measures will not be perceived as friendly. Mohammad Marandi, just enlighten us with that. You were mentioning in your first answer that the Straits of Hormuz would indeed be closed by Iran. That's really ratcheting up the pressure by Iran. But what is the intention if these economic sanctions do start to bite?
Well, I think it's quite obvious that the Iranians do not want any tension in the region. The point is that if neighboring countries do align themselves with an illegal American attempt to strangle the Iranian people, because that's basically what they're trying to do. They're trying to destroy the Iranian economy, make ordinary people suffer. If they work with the United States in doing that, then that is seen as an aggression against ordinary Iranians. And Iranians have already forgiven these countries in the past. We all remember that during the Iraq-Iran war, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, these countries funded the Saddam Hussein war machines. They helped him produce and use weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons against Iranians. After the war, the Iranians, in order to create a more favorable atmosphere in the region, they forgave these regimes. And this was, many ordinary Iranians found that difficult to accept, but still in the interest of the region, that is basically what Iran did. Now, the Iranians, as we all know, they are exporting a significant amount of oil to different countries. The Iranians also feel that countries do not want to support the American sanctions because, for example, China has lost out in the recent events. They've lost Sudan as a close ally to the United States, South Sudan separating from Sudan. And in Libya, the Chinese were hurt badly as well. So I think many countries do not want to rely on Saudi oil on the one hand. And also I think Saudi Arabia, since it has so many troubles both at home and with its neighbors such as Yemen, Iraq, Bahrain, and the people of Egypt, it wouldn't be in their interest to create greater tension with Iran. So the Iranians are hoping that the Saudis will continue to work within the framework of OPEC and not to cooperate with the United States, because the Iranians would see that as a Saudi alliance with Israel and Western European countries.
But many commentators are saying, look, Iran can't do this because if it shut the Straits of Hormuz, it would end up stopping its own exports. The Saudi oil minister has come out and said on Monday that it wouldn't be shut for long because at least American military might would reopen it again. The claim really is that they're empty threats.
No, I would disagree. First of all, the Iranians probably would not close the Strait of Hormuz. They would probably begin, I think, stop and search measures in the Persian Gulf region that would slow down traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. And I think it would be a major mistake for the Americans to miscalculate Iranian power. That's exactly what Israel did in southern Lebanon, and they were met with fierce resistance, and they lost the war. The Iranians, ever since the United States began threatening the country after the Axis of Evil speech, they have been preparing themselves. The Americans have been fighting war after war, invading country after country, tiring themselves out. But the Iranians, they've studied the American military, and I think the Iranians know they have many strengths from the north to the very south of the Persian Gulf region, as well as along the Indian Ocean.
Well, I think Mamdouh Salameh actually agrees with your strength. He was saying earlier on that he believes that the Revolutionary Guard could hold, I think you said so, the Straits of Hormuz. If that was the case, how much of an impact would it have on oil imports across the world?
Well, let me clarify a few points regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Iran will not venture to close the Strait of Hormuz unless its oil exports have been blocked. Iran has the capability to close the Strait of Hormuz, but as you are aware, the American Fifth Fleet and other allied navies can open it in a short while. But that doesn't mean that Iran will not mine it again and again. There are other measures also that Iran can take. They can sabotage the Saudi oil installations, particularly Ras Tanura, where most of Saudi oil exports go. So the threat is a real threat, but Iran will not take that route unless its exports have been blocked. Now, with that in mind, the only way that the exports could be blocked if the Security Council takes a decision or takes a resolution to block Iranian oil exports. That will not happen because China and Russia will use their veto. So it is hypothetical to talk now about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I know that Iran has advised rather than warned its Arab friends in OPEC not to increase their production to offset any cutting of Iranian oil exports. Iran need not worry, and Iran is aware that OPEC does not have that capacity to increase production, and the Arab Gulf producers don't have the capacity either.
Well, Willem Van Kemenade, is there a fear in China as to how this might well escalate?
Well, if it escalates into a real military conflict, and one line of speculation is that Israel, during the heat of the election campaign, somewhere around mid-year, may launch a limited adventure attack on the Iranian nuclear installations. That could very well lead to war, because the hardliners in the United States could very well force President Obama to follow Israel. If he doesn't, he may lose his re-election. So, well, there is nothing that China could do against that. Militarily, China has only a small naval unit in the Arabian Sea to deal with Somali pirates. But what China could do, of course, is very forceful diplomacy in the United Nations to block another American de facto war there. Moreover, a country like Japan, which is the second largest importer of Iranian oil, it is an obedient ally of the United States, but that doesn't mean that it is going to implement these demands of the United States. Japan has said it needs time for that. It can only respond in a phased way, but it's very inconvenient, and well, it remains to be seen whether this embargo is really going to be a success, because the term for full implementation is, of course, 180 days. And who knows what will happen. This kind of exchange of letters between, well, whom in the US we don't know exactly, and the Ayatollah Khamenei is perhaps one signal that diplomacy will resume in some way.
Mamdouh, Salameh, history is littered with failed oil embargoes. I'm thinking Cuba, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and of course Iraq. What about the actual, if this oil embargo actually does hold, what about the repercussions in economies across the world? Are we looking at $200 a barrel? Are we looking at a real impact, often on economies that are already on life support?
Well, let me first start by saying I don't believe there will be an embargo or a stoppage of Iranian oil exports, because the biggest loser from that will be the United States, which is the biggest consumer of oil and the biggest importer so far. So as for the price, well, we are in the worst recession since the 30s, and the price has been hovering between 110 and 130 for a whole year. Can you imagine when the global economy starts to move, what would the price be? And what would supposedly an embargo due to the price. I project a price of $150 to $170 in the next 3-4 years, even without embargo and without closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So in that case, if there is any trouble or any conflict or any stoppage of Gulf oil production passing through the Strait of Hormuz, for a short while the price could hit more than $200, but it will reverts back to what we expect it to be, $150 to $170 by the year 2015, even without any conflict or any troubles.
Mohammad Marandi, nobody wants to see this escalate, this situation. Is there any wiggle room on the Iranian side? Is there any concessions, any compromise that the current situation with Iran on the nuclear program that can be offered to try and put people back around the negotiating table?
Well, before I answer that question, I just would like to also point out that I doubt that exports would go from northern Iraq or Central Asia either if there is real conflict, and there will be upheaval throughout the Middle East. But in response to that question, I think that the Iranians have already done that. The Russians have recently put forward a step-by-step proposal. The Iranians have accepted it in principle, even though they do have their reservations. Senior Russian officials told the Iranians that the Americans are on board, but later it turned out that the Americans were not very honest and they were not in fact on board. And this is what happened last year with the Tehran Declaration. The Americans initially told the Brazilians and the Turks that they accepted their efforts, and when they succeeded, the Obama basically lied and went for sanctions. So the Iranians have been trying to resolve the issue. But what can Iran do?
Moving forwards?
American drones
is there anything you can see moving forwards? Is there any space there that can bring people together?
Well, on the one hand, the Iranians have American drones flying over Iranian airspace illegally, Iranian scientists being assassinated by Western intelligence agencies, the United States and its allies constantly threatening Iran with war and attack. The Iranians have been very calculated and very measured in their responses so far. But I think that the Iranians are looking to see if Western European countries and the United States are sincere and if they're willing to go with the Russian proposal. Otherwise, if the Americans and the Europeans do not accept the Russian proposal, I think that basically it shows that the issue is not the nuclear program. The issue is Iranian independence and sovereignty. Western European and North American countries feel that they're losing out in the Middle East, and as a result, they're putting immense pressure on countries that are in opposition to it. But there is a solution, and I think that is the Russian proposal that the Iranians have already said that they are willing to move forward with.
Willem Van Kemenade, on the question of China and Iran relations, they've been doing business, China's been doing business with Iran since the revolution. Is this, do you think, a time that we're going to see China stand by Iran? We've touched on the United Nations, how there will not be a majority with China and Russia both saying, no, we don't accept these. Is this another one of those times where China's going to say, no, we stand by Iran?
Well, stand by Iran, yes, but not under any circumstances. China has to consider its vital relationship with the United States, and it won't risk a complete confrontation with the United States over Iran. Having said that, China has vast interests. It has made large investments in Iran since the mid-1980s, at the height of the Iran-Iraq war. It was a big arms supplier, but it also has invested in large infrastructure projects such as the Tehran subway, railroads, other ports, and it's the largest oil and gas importer. So it won't abandon that or scale that down in any significant way. But of course, China has always to weigh its priorities in its more vital relationship with the United States.
OK, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us in Beijing, Willem Van Kemenade in London, Mamdouh Salameh and Mohammad Marandi in Beirut.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.